Hello and welcome to the podcast about digital fatalism, a podcast that discusses the influence of digital technology over our lives in both how it's used, how it's designed, and how we think about it, how we talk about it and frame it. So today I'm talking to Kyle Macdonald, who is absolutely one of my favourite artists ever. And as well as talking about his work and his artistic practice, we go into topics like facial recognition being used in not public spaces, but large gatherings, which a lot of people attend and so might seem public. We talk about AI being used to understand cultural heritage projects. We cover the failure rate of different AI tools and how often they get things wrong, and also certain data points being used as proxies for something else. So when you maybe legally can't discriminate against someone for a certain characteristic, what happens when other pieces of data can come together and form proxies? We talk a little bit about the CIA and their role in funding the development of certain technologies too. So I hope you enjoy this episode. As always, I start by asking everyone who comes on the podcast, what do you think about when you hear the term digital fatalism? What might that mean to you?
I've never heard of this phrase before, so it's new to me. When I hear digital fatalism, I guess the first thing I think is something like a feeling of inevitability. It feels adjacent to the kind of accelerationism that shows up in a lot of the tech utopian spaces, but it's new. Is this your phrase, or is this someone else, or where's this come from?
Well, when I was writing my PhD proposal, I've been for a long time in my work being critiquing surveillance technologies. When I was gathering all my thoughts on this, I was like, well, they are really fatalistic in the way that, they make very set judgments about people. And then once those technologies have made those judgments, it's very difficult to escape them.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, from your description that you just gave, I think more about some work that I've done with like Lauren Lee McCarthy, where we've made installations and apps and experiences that are designed to critique or respond to the way that a lot of online services, apps, technologies kind of box us into a certain set of decisions. One of the shorthands Lauren and I use when we're talking about this is we think about the Facebook like button, and it started as this, you either like or don't like something, and it's a very limited view of how you can express yourself. It expanded a little bit. I don't know what it was like 10 years ago, and now you've got like 5 different things you can do, and that's become the funnel for who you can be online. And by virtue of having those options, it also modifies the way that you see yourself, and you are constantly being forced to decide which of these 5 things am I. And I think a lot of the technology that we interface with has some version of that. But it's not just technology, it's society and culture more broadly. It's like we create cultural scripts to interact with each other, and we fit into them. We perform them so that we can kind of get along and be legible to each other. And because when we zoom out like really far, I'd like to think maybe it's not something new or special to our modern era. It might just be the most recent, incarnation of something we've been doing as humans for a very long time. And I would hope that it's not something that's a kind of monotonic change in society, but it's something that we're constantly struggling with, finding ourselves falling into scripts and then breaking out of them. And I would hope that artists especially have the ability to help us kind of think beyond and break out of those scripts.
Yeah. And just a little reflection on something that you said at the beginning there. It was it's interesting with the way that we are given how we're able to interact with social media and, saying whether we like something or we don't like something, and the options that are presented there. It's that's a case where we're seen as having agency online, but really how much agency do we have if those kind of possibilities are laid out in such a kind of set form?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can feel comforting too. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. Sometimes it can be nice to have fewer options. Sometimes that's where creativity can thrive. But yeah, sometimes it can also be a mode of sort of fascist control as well. And I think what we get out of it is up to us. And when we want to push back, that's also up to us.
So in your artistic practice, you've often shone a spotlight on surveillance technologies in the past, and you've made quite a few things drawn upon facial recognition in particular. Would you say it's fair that these kind of technologies are quite fatalistic, possibly by design? Is this something that makes them appealing to government agencies that might be using facial recognition software, or some kind of, like a system that analyzes facial expression and then deduces what emotion we're apparently feeling at that time?
It's hard to say whether face analysis technology is inherently fair or unfair. And I think of this kind of law from Melvin Kranzberg, where he says, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. I think it has to do with the way that it's used. There are biases and like ways that technologies can be sort of designed to be used most easily, like affordances that make them most applicable to certain categories and kinds of harms and abuses. And I do think a lot of face analysis technology has some of that in it, but that doesn't mean that it's kind of impossible to use it well. There's a lot of uses of face analysis tech within like a cultural heritage space when you're looking at millions of photos from large archive and trying to cross-reference them and understand who are these people and where are they from and are they still around and can we interview them about these historical situations that were happening. I mean, there's a specific example of this I worked on, which is the Teenie Harris archive, which documented the life, kind of daily life over a period of decades in Pittsburgh. And the photographer, Teenie Harris, didn't keep notes on his photos. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about, who are these people and where are they? And a lot of those people in the photos are still alive. And curators wanted some help, like trying to understand, connections across the images and relationships and stuff like that. So turns out face analysis and face recognition specifically is really helpful for that in a way that can be hard for a human to individually kind of process. But then there's also plenty of other situations where it can be abused quite easily, starting with in the US, like it was really around, I think it was the 2001 Super Bowl is one of the moments where I identify as like being the first moment that face recognition sort of got kicked off for real. And what happened was they deployed face recognition at the entrance to the stadium and they were looking for people that they believed were criminals based on some predefined database of photos of people they were looking for. They didn't tell anyone they were doing this. They just did it. And, it's hard to find any information about like whether they thought it was successful or not, but apparently it was successful enough that they started to deploy it across Florida, like within a couple of years. I think, it's, when these tools are used without any kind of public discussion, that's a problem. When they're used in ways that are inherently biased towards specific kind of marginalized groups, like that's also a problem. I think when they are used to just kind of reinforce existing power dynamics instead of subvert them, that's a problem. And of course, that's how they're going to be used. I think when they're used in non-transparent ways broadly, that's a problem. And like, we don't really have a good idea of how the Facebook face recognition and labeling system works and like where it succeeds and fails and, when it does and doesn't tag people in photos. There's a little bit of ambiguity around that. And I would like to see more transparency with those systems. I don't think transparency is the solution, but I do think that it's an important part of accountability. And we can't really properly audit or give feedback on what we want these systems to do unless we have some access to how they're implemented and working. And I think that's a lot of what I've been trying to do with my work is to create installations and experiences where people have an intuitive understanding of what's happening behind the scenes in a way that we don't normally get access to. So like this project Facework, one of the things I was trying to do there is give people an opportunity to see face attribute recognition in real time, which is, there's different types of face analysis. There's face detection, which is like drawing a box around a face, so that you can know. It's like what your iPhone does, like when you show yourself and it focuses on your face, it knows where a face is. Then there's face recognition, which is like when you unlock your phone, it's knowing the difference between different faces. And then there's also face attribute and recognition or face attribute analysis, which is identifying things like, this person's smiling or not, this person's wearing sunglasses, this person has bushy eyebrows. It's everything from things that are sort of inherent to your physical appearance, all the way to things that are accessories or momentary gestures that you're making, even some kind of socially defined categories that have some basis in physical appearance, like race. And when those systems run, they run behind the scenes. We don't get to see them operating. We don't get to judge their efficacy, and we don't get to have an intuition for how it feels to be seen that way. When we're talking to someone else who's making judgments about us and responding to us a certain way, we have like a feeling of, them doing that and what that feels like to us. But when it happens in an automated way, we do not. And I wanted to make a system where you could see it, because what happened when I was digging into this tech was that I reproduced it. I ran it locally. I tried to get it working in real time. And then I found like, wow, even though these papers report really like high accuracy rates, they actually fail constantly in really weird, funny ways. And it's hard to explain that unless you can just give the experience to someone and have them build their own intuition for it. And there's a place for like explaining it too. There's a place for like journalism and research articles and podcasts to like explain this kind of phenomena. But I think one of the things art and maybe kind of creative approaches like design in general can do is give people this kind of direct intuitive experience of like, wow, maybe facial attribute recognition doesn't really work as well as they say it does. And when I'm sitting down with it to like try and subvert it directly, it turns out it's like quite easy. It's a long-winded answer to the question of, is it fair or not?
Yeah, you mentioned like these systems often have like a really high failure rate. And I think like that is entering the mainstream discourse as circulated through like news media. But there's still an appeal to use these tools. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting reasons for why these tools are used. Sometimes they're used in advertising. I mean, it's not always like law enforcement. Sometimes they're used in advertising to segment the market based on appearance. Sometimes there are practical uses, like I said, like, auto-focusing a camera or unlocking your phone or doing cultural heritage work. This is not like a, uniquely 100% bad technology. But, one of the projects that got me interested in face attribute recognition, one of the research articles I found, it gives a quite disturbing example of why these technologies are used sometimes. So there's an insurance company I found that was basically trying to figure out how to change people's insurance premiums based on how they looked. And apparently the reason that they were doing this is because there are laws that say you can't change people's insurance premiums based on like their body mass index, for example. It's just not allowed. However, if you train a neural network to estimate someone's body mass index from a photo, and then no one ever sees the body mass index, it just gives you like an insurance premium adjustment. Then it turns out that might be a workaround. Like maybe you could argue for that being legally okay. So already quite gross that they're doing this. It gets even more gross when you realize that the way that they trained this model is by taking photos of hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the US and looking at databases of pictures aligned with height and weight, and then predicting body mass index from that data. And so now you have a bunch of incarcerated people who are unwillingly, non-consensually having their data being used to basically buttress this incredibly harmful system that's running behind the scenes and kind of taking advantage of a potential legal loophole. So sometimes this tech is used to just like be a placeholder for a human decision that is illegal, and when we put the machine system in the place of the human, sometimes that can open up legal loopholes that are quite profitable.
And with your work, I Spy, could you talk a little bit about that?
I made I Spy back during the first Trump presidency in summer of 2018, after it had been, a year and a half or something. And I was feeling really frustrated and paralyzed by the way that immigrants were being treated at detention facilities across the US along the southern border. And there were a lot of reports of really terrible living conditions, and specifically immigration and customs enforcement employees who were really mistreating the people that were being apprehended. And there was all this like forcible separation of children from their families and a lot of other really terrible things that were happening. And I started to notice that the tech industry was not exactly, didn't have their hands clean in this situation. You also had around the same time, like this Project Maven work from Google that was with the US Department of Defense. And Microsoft was also supplying tools like face recognition tools, for example, to ICE. And I wanted to make something that used those same tools to do the opposite of what ICE was trying to accomplish. And I also wanted to show that there are real people behind organizations like ICE. It's not just like a big homogenous blob of evil. It's actually made up by people who are just deciding to do their jobs and follow orders, And like whenever you hear stories about caged children or sexually abused detainees, like that, those are normal, somewhat normal, real people. And I thought it would be interesting to basically see a reflection of ourselves in those people. What iSpy does is it basically takes a picture of you and then it finds the ICE employee who looks most like you. And it uses Microsoft's face recognition to do that. One of the interesting things that happened was, well, I released this project anonymously. Actually, I didn't release it under my own name because I was thinking like it might have a bigger impact if people didn't know who made it. And it would also be it would protect me a little bit. There had just been some major blowback to a project just before iSpy, which was Sam Levine had collected thousands of photos of ICE employees from LinkedIn. There were like a bunch of online activists that like came for his teaching job at NYU when they found out about this. And I was using his data. I used Sam's, photos, and I wanted to see if it would have a bigger impact if it was anonymous. I think actually I might have made the wrong decision in retrospect. It might have had a bigger impact if people could have kind of put my face to it and have started a witch hunt. But, the kind of all of the logistics around these kinds of projects are always a little unpredictable. The way that virality works is always unpredictable. Anyway, you go to the website, you take a photo of yourself, and then it would find an ICE employee that looks most like you. And ostensibly, this could also be used to check if someone that is an ICE employee, or maybe even when you're seeing someone in person, like which ICE employee are they? And I think that feeling of like being able to do face recognition across a system of individuals that have some kind of power, that feels really different than the way that face recognition is normally used. I think, I don't know, there's something that can feel a little empowering about just knowing, okay, I have this tool available to me and I can use face recognition as a tool in a way that feels empowering to me. Strangely enough, after a couple of years of this running, it stopped working because Microsoft actually changed their policies. Microsoft realized that it was kind of causing potentially more harm than good, or maybe it was just too big of a business liability for them to be providing face recognition services to just anybody. And now you basically have to have like a special licensing agreement with them in order to use their face recognition. So I do not have that agreement, and that meant that iSpy got kicked offline. Technically, it's not an issue. I could replace it with another API or another library. But in practice, I really like this idea that it's now impossible to make iSpy using Microsoft technologies. So since Microsoft was one of the kind of most complicit organizations here, sort of the mission's accomplished in some regard.
Yeah, it tells part of the story. It does, like, yeah, it's important part of that, how that technology has developed and how those companies have, they change over time.
They do. They change over time. They're not static, and they have a lot of good people inside trying to make things better. There are some companies who are sort of inherently misaligned with the public good, like Palantir. I don't think that what they're trying to do broadly is ever going to be anything but harmful. But companies like Google, Microsoft, even Facebook to some extent, they're complex organisms that have really multifaceted goals that are sometimes in opposition to each other. They have factions within the company that are trying to help and others that are trying to aid the defense industry. And I've done also consulting for different companies like Google over the years, or, I did a residency at Spotify 10 years ago. I helped organize the first kind of media artist residency at Spotify. I think the best place to be for someone who's creative or like has some kind of good intentions is probably at the border, like working sometimes on the inside and sometimes on the outside. I feel like it would be silly to not accept how ingrained these ecosystems are and to try and manipulate them and work with them. I think sometimes as an artist, like I want to just be only on the outside and push back and sort of like stop the growth and stop the damage. But it turns out sometimes being inside can also be quite effective in its own way. There's discussions that can happen. There's changes that can happen. For certain, like Microsoft, I don't know the full story, but Microsoft stopping the face recognition service for just any old API user. I'm sure there was someone inside who was like, look, this is not going to go well. Like, we're going to get sued, or this is going to open us up to more liability, or, here are some people who are using it in ways that we just don't like. And we're either going to need to start policing this and devote a lot of resources to doing that, or we're going to need to like start, whitelisting, allow listing people so that they can use this only when we explicitly agree with their use case. And there were other people who were amenable to that, and I'd love to hear the full story of how that happens. But it happens, and that's not something that was imposed on them by public legislation, or that wasn't something that they were forced to do by another organization. That was just something that came internally. So I would like to, like I said, I'd like to exist at this border between these spaces. And I think that's one of the best places for artists. Someone told me recently, you can't hijack a plane unless you get on the plane. And it's a little bit of an intense metaphor, but sometimes I feel like that's the way to think about it. Like, you want to be in it would be a mistake to think that you can escape the ecosystem that you live in. I can't get out of capitalism. I can't kind of participate in the system and also not be complicit. So the question isn't about how do I reject it most perfectly. I think the question is about how do I thrive and help other people thrive within a toxic ecosystem, within a system that is exploitative and harmful. Where are the affordances to actually make it livable, to make it better, to reduce some of those harms? And I think I've become a little bit less of a revolutionary over time. I'd be open to a revolution. That would be pretty sick, but I think maybe that's not where I see myself right now. I see myself navigating this really like amorphous, multifaceted, multi-relational ecosystem, and trying to find ways to insert myself so that I can kind of change some of those flows and make things a little less terrible.
Yeah, and it sounds like your approach is identifying spaces where you can exercise agency and make a change. And that in itself is a challenge to these fatalistic narratives, because it is kind of like these systems work based on the complicity of everyone who's involved from, across the spectrum of like this power dynamic. So it's like, not opting out and finding a way to make a difference in those contexts, in those environments.
Yeah, I love the way you just put it, of not opting out, It's also not exactly opting in. It's sort of like acknowledging that you cannot opt out. That's how it feels to me. It's like, okay, well, we've got these GPUs, we've got these neural networks, we've got these face recognition models. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to use it for cultural heritage work in this beautiful way? Are we going to use it to sort of light a fire under power a little bit, or just kind of do something funny and silly for a minute? I mean, something like I Spy is not a practical tool of exercising power. This is bit of a kind of silly, humorous intervention that is helpful for our imagination more than it is for our kind of direct liberation. But I mean, that's where everything starts, is with your imagination. So I think that it's just as important.
But what I particularly love about that work is like it's using the technology that is usually used by people with the power against marginalized communities, and it's like flipping it.
Yeah, and there's another project I want to shout out called Capture by Paulo Chirio, which has some of those same elements. He was doing face recognition across police during some protests in France. I think he collected in 2020 1,000 public images of police that were in photos during those protests. And I don't know if you remember those protests, but there was quite a lot of violence and questions about, the efficacy and fairness of the police action there. And what he ended up doing was printing the headshots as like street art posters and posting them throughout Paris to also like kind of put them in this public space. And then he also built a database with a kind of crowdsourced identification tool to figure out who they all were. And then his sort of final action as part of this project was to have a petition that got over 50,000 signatures supporting a ban on facial recognition in Europe. And I think that I'm always skeptical about like the kind of practical efficacy of these sort of artistic interventions. But I think something like using those interventions to raise awareness for a petition that could potentially have real like legislative change, that's incredible. That's like such a great way to be an artist in this space.
I think it's like one of the difficulties with that thing is that you don't want it to, well, from my perspective anyway, you don't want it to kind of create this divide where it's like you've got the art on the one side and then you've got the activism, and it's like, well, the activism is the thing that makes the real change, The art in itself is also like it's also has its own outcomes, it has its own value.
Absolutely. Yeah. It does feel hard when technology is used to make so many big changes in society and like completely upend our lives sometimes. It's like, well, if we're artists working with technology, shouldn't we be able to kind of do the same upending? But I don't know, working in the imaginary space, in the imaginative space, working with imagination, working with people's ideas of what's possible. I don't know. I think we underestimate that. We do think that we should be able to make more practical kind of legal, social changes, and we don't acknowledge that we could be making a lot more changes to our collective consciousness.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of historic lineages that kind of have developed towards the current technologies as we have them today. I don't know if you have any thoughts or reflections on that in terms of how surveillance technologies have developed. Like, where does it stem from in your view?
One of the places I identify as like the first moment that face analysis or face identification became like a thing was in the early 1960s. There was this guy, Woodrow Bledsoe, who was one of the original face recognition researchers. He was working at Sandia Corporation, and they were using like photocell mosaics, which is, the earliest version of digital imaging technology. And in the 60s, he worked with two people, Helen Chan and Charles Bisson, on the first face recognition algorithms at this company, Panoramic Research Incorporated. And some of this was actually only came public in the last 10 years. And the reason is that Panoramic Research, it turns out, was actually a part of a CIA funded organization, which was operating through a front company called King Hurley Research. So the CIA was basically funding the earliest face recognition research, and it didn't work. It was the work that they were doing initially was so basic and bad. It was comparing two images to each other directly and being it doesn't we can't compare two images unless we really manipulate the contrast and brightness and change the face perspective in this really profound way. So we're going to have to like make measurements between, different facial features. And that was how face recognition worked for a long time. It was like looking at the relative measurements between key points on the face and then identifying sort of geometric relationship between two faces. At that point from the 60s and then into the 80s, that face recognition just wasn't really a thing. They started to use like principal components analysis and neural networks for classification towards the end of the 80s. And then they started to use those techniques generally, like PCA and neural nets, towards the ends of the 80s. And then in the early 90s, it was used for face identification. And in the mid 90s, there was this database called FERET, F-E-R-E-T, the Facial Recognition Technology Database, which was like the first baseline for doing face recognition and like trying to make an estimate of how well your face recognition algorithm worked. And that was also government funded, but it was not the CIA. That was like a kind of public science organization that was funding it. And it still wasn't great. But some of those techniques started to work a little bit. And then they also had, with this database, the ability to say, how well was it working, which was that's always been the clincher. Even in modern machine learning, the question is not like, do we have a technology to do something kind of like this or not? The question is, do we have a database or like a validation data set that allows us to say how well this is working? Because once you can kind of rate your current ability, that's when your ability starts to improve with all kinds of things machine learning related. Then, like I had mentioned earlier in 2001, there was this Super Bowl in January, and that was maybe the first time that face recognition was rolled out properly in a public venue in real time. And I think it's all been kind of interestingly downhill since then. There's been a lot of advances in face recognition accuracy. There's been different, technical revelations. Like it turns out PCA is just the beginning of doing face recognition. Neural networks have kind of come and gone and then come back and stayed recently for face recognition. There were all of these developments in like the early 2000s from companies like Facebook trying to normalize faces in new ways, which means like doing things like frontalization, where you're looking at the face from the front, even if the photo was taken from the side. There's been a lot of interesting technical developments in the last like 15 years, especially with the rise of neural networks. You can also go back the other direction before the 60s and find like the origins of face recognition in some of the earliest criminal mugshot tracking systems. There was this guy, Alphonse Bertillon, this guy. Alphonse was like this, he was in the 1880s to 1914. He was building these indexical records of facial features where he was trying to explain typologies of different parts of the face and making drawings of like how to properly measure all the different parts of the face. And the reason he was doing this was so that they could basically track criminals. They could build up like mugshots with data sheets. And this is also like very, recently post photography, right? So it's like, oh, how do you know when someone has escaped from prison, how to find them again? Well, you have to be able to communicate exactly what they look like so that you have some idea of what their identity is. And that can, in a way that can be communicated across multiple, like police organizations. And that's the real like beginning of this technology. It's like, what do we do once we have photography and measuring systems? Well, that we use it to identify the proportions of someone's face and communicate them to other people who are trying to track that person in a way that allows us to control them. And it's pretty like a undeniable lineage from like the 1880s all the way to the 1980s. It took a while for it to be automated computationally, but it was the exact same thing. And then it got rolled out at the Super Bowl 2001 for exactly the same purposes. There are other cases in the early 2000s of like, like I was saying, the police in in Florida starting to roll out face recognition at stops on the highway when they would pull people over. And I don't know, I think the full story there is quite complex, but that would be like my general outline would be something like Bertillon in the 80s through early 1910s was measuring faces from photos to communicate them to other police. And then in the 80s, we started to get the first kind of working face recognition algorithms. In the 90s, we started to refine them with the Ferret database. In the early 2000s, it got rolled out to the public for the first time. And then early 2010s, companies like Facebook started to take it into their own hands. And the thing that's really changed in the last like 5 to 10 years specifically is that these technologies are working so well that they've kind of plateaued. And the best tech that is available to like a government agency is now also available to the public. You can go on GitHub right now and download a face recognition model that is just as good as anything that any government has. And that's kind of exciting because it opens up this sort of democratic space of innovation for things that are interesting and useful. Like I mentioned cultural heritage work, but it also potentially could lead to new kinds of systems of control that we are, completely unaccountable to the public.
There was one tiny little thing actually I wanted to ask you, and a slightly different, well, maybe related, but so I noticed when I was looking at your work on your website that you often include like code and like GitHub.
Yeah. So I come from this lineage of open source software, which can trace its route back to a previous movement called free software. Free software, the idea was that you don't really have control over your own hardware unless you also have control over the software that's running on it. And that's where projects like Linux came from, where you have lots of people contributing together to the same operating system in a way that anyone can change, parts of their operating system if they have the technical knowledge and emotional capacity to dive into such a complex ecosystem. Anyway, out of free software rose another movement, which was the open source movement, which is a bit more of like business-friendly commercial version, which was a little less anarchist and still had some kind of centralized control, but was generally about organizations providing access to their source code, even if it wasn't necessarily being developed by a kind of ragtag group of many people across the globe, which is what free software tended to be. There's other ways to describe the difference between those two, but I just wanted to say that there is a difference. And I came from the open source part. I wasn't really as exposed to the free software part because it was a little older and it's a little bit more niche. So you've got these websites like GitHub now that basically are for people to share everything that they've written with their code, all the code they've ever written. It's maybe similar to like some of these old like blog websites, like when you had Blogger, or now we have Medium, or there's Substack. The same way that people will post what they're writing to those blogging platforms, GitHub is a little bit like that for code. So when people are working on code or a new app or software, they will post it to GitHub to share with other people who also want to use that code. It can also be a kind of like political act to post code there, because what you're doing is you're saying that you want to give other people access to the same tools that you have. You want to share the knowledge that you've gained by this research, and you want to be part of like a bigger ecosystem and not having this be closed off. It's also, as a creative person, it's kind of like a challenge to myself to kind of always innovate and do the next thing within the arts, especially within like the kind of art world and art market. Pretty much what you're encouraged to do as an artist is to find one thing and do it really well, just over and over, so that people can keep collecting it and saying, oh yeah, that's a Kyle Macdonald, like you've got one of those. And when I post work to GitHub, part of what I'm trying to do is to give the means of making my work to other people in a way that forces me to not rely on gatekeeping my own ideas and tools, but instead rely on my own kind of inner ability to innovate and always do the next thing. So it's a little bit of like a gauntlet for myself, and I think other people feel the same way. It also serves to document and provide a kind of archive of what is maybe most relevant in many media art projects, which is the code itself. It's the thing that will eventually be needed to make it work, decades from now, if it's still relevant. And it's the thing that media archivists and curators might look back on to try and understand how to get something alive and working again. I'm interested in the kind of long view of the arts. And I think in maybe 100 years, if we're still operating as a society the same way that we are now, we might look back on this moment and realize that media artists who are working with technology in this like early 2000s era will have, or let's say early 21st century era, have been in a new kind of relationship to technology and capitalism that is kind of unique to this moment. And the code will be like one of the main points of kind of unpacking that relationship. The libraries that we're using, the ways that we're working with each other, the ways that individuals are sort of interfacing with large corporations. I do part-time consulting for companies like Google sometimes. And when media archaeologists look back on this moment in like 100 years and see those kinds of relationships and unpack them, like that's going to be, I don't know, we're at the beginning of something very new and weird, and we don't really have the words for it yet. And I think that's part of why I post stuff on GitHub, is to kind of let all of those traces remain so that in the future they can be unpacked better.
This podcast is being supported by Northern Bridge Consortium, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council.